Hello, buyers and sellers. Thank you for watching this video. This video is actually meant for people on either side, buyers or sellers, because it's going over the purchase contract. And do know that, well, first and foremost, grab a cup of coffee again and pen and paper and write down any questions that you have during the video as you listen to me discuss it and go through the pages. First and foremost, please note that this is a contract that was written by attorneys, and it is widely used throughout the Chicagoland area with multiple different realtor boards. So real estate attorneys should be very used to seeing it. And all I am allowed to do is to fill in blanks. So we're going to go through it. It is 13 pages total. I appreciate you watching this because I'm sure you'll have several questions that are more specific to the property that you're looking at or selling, so we can go over those individually afterwards. All right, so I have my little cheat sheet here. Page 1, obviously the buyer name and the seller name, and that can be obviously your own personal names, or if you're purchasing or selling land that will be in or property that will be in a trust, or if it's in the name of a company, let me know that as well. Paragraph 2, the real estate, that just, again, we fill in the approximate lot size, the address, the PIN number. And then on lines 11 through 14, that actually pertains mostly to if you have like a condo in Chicago that has separate deeded parking spaces. So for the most part with farm and ranch, those don't apply. Moving on to paragraph 3, these are fixtures and personal property. So for buyers, the personal property information should generally be on the listing sheet, and we should be able to see what's included and not. And that is taken from the listing agreement that the listing agent has filled out with their seller, whether that's me or another agent. But long story short, regardless of what's automatically included, if you're a buyer and see something that you specifically want to make sure is included, we can add that here. So definitely want to check what the buyer wants to have included. And then and if the seller isn't automatically going to include it, that will be part of the negotiation. So it's very important that agents cross-reference what's in the listing agreement versus what is being asked for from the buyer. When you go to line 29, it says other items included. And that can sometimes be things like a pool table or a hot tub, because sellers don't necessarily want to move those things. It's kind of difficult. Or with farm and ranch properties, on occasion I get equipment that's included, although it is slightly discouraged to do that because lenders really don't like to see equipment included, especially if it's a higher ticket item like an expensive tractor. Items not included, that might be something, for example, that a seller wants to make sure that buyers are aware that they're taking with them. So, for example, one time I had a seller who had a special chandelier in their dining room, and they were going to take that with them. So they replaced the chandelier with a different light, but what we are trying to avoid is any issues during the final walkthrough where a buyer, may assume that something is staying and that it's not. Let's see. And then, let's see. Dropping down to paragraph 4, purchase price and payment. This is for buyers. It's your offer price, and once a final agreement is made, an agent will, correct anything in the contract and then resend it for initials and signatures. So sometimes what we do is, cross off the prices and correct it. Other times we'll just start from scratch and do a clean slate on the finalized contract once all the verbal agreements have been made. Credit at closing. If you are a buyer and need a credit at closing to help you with your closing costs, that line 41 is where we would put that. That's something that it depends on how much you have for down payment and if you are stretching in order to purchase. If you have plenty of down payment, then the closing cost credit typically isn't asked for. Earnest money, I primarily represent sellers, and as a seller's agent, I do typically like to see the buyers put at least 1% earnest money down. Now, it's not a must. It's appreciated, and if you want to do more than that, great. It shows that the buyer has some skin in the game and interest. But one thing to know about earnest money is that if a buyer backs out of a contract for a legal reason, they are due their earnest money back. The only time a seller would be able to fight for the earnest money, and I shouldn't say only, I'm not an attorney, but an example would be if a buyer, say, signed a contract with a seller and then it was past the 5-day attorney review period and another property came on the market that they just liked better and they wanted to back out of the contract, that would be an instance where the seller may be able to fight for the earnest money. So I personally have never seen earnest money go back or go to the seller. It's always gone back to the buyer. So let's see, on the top, flipping over to page 2, on the top, typically the seller's brokerage will hold the earnest money. There is an occasion where, say, for example, sometimes smaller brokerages do not have escrow accounts, and then therefore maybe the buyer's broker will hold the earnest money, or an attorney, as long as both parties agree and that person or company has an escrow account, that's where it goes. Closing date. We need to have some type of closing date, and if a buyer is getting a loan, 30 days out is a typical turnaround time. Sometimes I see 45. And of course, with farm and ranch properties, we, that closing is always negotiable. Sometimes it depends on if a buyer has a property to sell, but some date has to be in here, and it can always get modified through the attorneys, and as long as everybody agrees. So, yes, sometimes there's extensions requested and whatnot, which we would cover at that time. Possession. Possession of the property is typically delivered at closing. So again, that is something that is negotiable and can be worked out, and I will touch on a little bit later in the contract here. The possession, let me touch on that for a minute. Like post-closing possession, some people are very skeptical about that. And I've done it a lot where, sellers may need to stay in the property a little, like a week after closing just to get all of their stuff out. Because with the farm properties, moving is hard enough, let alone, a house and a barn and animals. So, sometimes we will give the buyer possession of the house, but then we'll retain possession of a barn, for a week or a month, just to finish closing out. So it's whatever you all can agree on is what can happen. So financing, if a buyer is financing, this next paragraph 7 is where we fill out what type of loan you're getting and how much money you're borrowing in terms of percent of the purchase price, and then also your approximate interest rate. So the interest rate is kind of important because, say, for example, with these rising rates, if the rate nowadays is 5.75 and we put in there, that the interest rate not to exceed 6% and rates go up to 6.25. If you're still okay with that as the buyer and you still qualify for your loan, great. But if rates go up to 6.25 and for some reason that you can't get the loan because your debt to income ratio is too heavy or whatever the case, then, your loan would be denied, and that's a legal way out of the contract. Let's see. And as a buyer, you do need to make sure that you make a full loan application within 10 business days of signing the purchase contract. If you are a cash buyer, there are two different paragraphs here, one where it is all cash with no mortgage, or cash transaction but a mortgage would be allowed. And that would be if, for example, you have the money but you do want to try to get a mortgage because, say, your money is in investments, and it might, you might have to pay a penalty, or your investments are making more than the interest rate on a loan, so you'd want to get a loan. But so one of those two paragraphs can be checked if you're a cash buyer. Statutory disclosures. The sellers will have filled out multiple different disclosures. You should get a copy of those to sign, and obviously read and sign, because it'll tell you anything that the sellers are aware is wrong with the property. And paragraph 8 is just stating that you have received copies of those, you being the buyer. Let's see, proration. So there's a couple different things that get prorated, and with farm and ranch properties, first and foremost is always the real estate taxes, since in Illinois we pay taxes in the rears. So those get prorated through the day of the closing. The seller is responsible for paying real estate taxes for the time that they occupy the property. But since we pay in the rears, the buyer will then be responsible for actually making those payments when the tax bills come out. So typically the seller gives the buyer a credit for that. Another thing is propane. For all of you on liquid propane, when we get about a week prior to closing, the seller should do a final read on their LP tank, and their provider should provide them with an invoice or a statement stating how many gallons are left in the tank, at what rate it was purchased at, so that then the buyer can purchase the propane from the seller, and that can all be worked into the final closing costs. It doesn't have to be a separate check or anything like that. The other thing that may be prorated, and it just depends again on how you work it out, is if we have tillable ground and there was any rents paid for the ground during harvest or planting season. So let's see. All right, then we are moving on to paragraph 10, which is attorney review. And this is, so within the first 5 business days of acceptance of this contract, your attorney has the opportunity to review the contract. So there is no need to have your attorney look at it ahead of time. However, you can, but this paragraph protects you, both sides, so that your attorney can review it and either approve or disapprove the contract, or make suggestions on changes, except for the purchase price. Also, paragraph 11, waiver of professional inspections. This is not typically done. Buyers do typically want to do a home inspection, but there is an occasion, typically when there is a multiple offer situation, where some buyers may decide to waive inspections. Another example would be if somebody is, for example, in building and construction themselves and feel very comfortable at what they're looking at when they previewed the property to begin with. So those are a couple times when I've had buyers waive the inspection. But if you are going to go through and go ahead and do a home inspection, that inspection needs to be scheduled within 5 business days of the executed contract. So, home inspectors are aware of this time frame, so they are pretty readily available, and they typically get you the report either same day or the following day, just depending on when your appointment is, if it's morning or afternoon. Once you receive the report, you have another 5 days to review it and decide if you want to ask for any repairs, if there are any issues that you can't live with. Now, the contract says that it needs to be like major issues, There's so many times that buyers, the home inspector is paid to find items wrong with a house. So, sellers really just want to know, what buyers can't live with that they need to fix. And it's primarily, we're concerned with health and safety issues. So I always tell buyers to, if there's a big list, try to pick out the certain things that you can't live with that you really, really want fixed, because we don't want to give sellers, a list of 30 items to fix. And likewise, or I guess on the flip side, buyers and sellers can also negotiate this in terms of, if the requested items are, if there's 15 of them, maybe the sellers will agree to fix some, but not others. Maybe they'll agree to fix all of them or none of them, or maybe they'll even decide to give a credit in lieu of the repairs. So any kind of combination of those, it's all a negotiation and what people are comfortable with. Let's see. So paragraph 13, moving on, this just states that the buyer will be obtaining homeowners insurance. And paragraph 14, if in fact the property is in a floodplain, that they will also obtain flood insurance. And that is something that's on the disclosure. So if a property is in a flood zone and requires flood insurance, that needs to be disclosed. Paragraph 15 talks about a condominium, so that would not apply for the farm and ranch properties. Paragraph 16 just states that the seller will make sure that the buyer receives a good title to the property. And there are, paragraph 17, there are different taxes associated. Now, with the farm and ranch properties, typically it's always county and state taxes. If in fact a property is within city limits, which is very rare for me for farm and ranch, but on occasion, some cities do have city taxes as well. It's some don't, but some do. Paragraph 18, title. So the seller will pay for title, and the seller's attorney will order that. And then that will be given to the buyer's attorney to review, as well as underwriting. Plat of survey, paragraph 19, states that the seller will provide a plat of survey to the buyer. Now, sometimes with farm and ranch, I have sellers that have, previous surveys that we can use. One thing to know about the surveys is even if a buyer is willing to accept an older survey, sometimes the title company will not, because they won't insure it. So it just kind of depends on the title company and how old the survey is. But that can save sellers some money if we do have one where there's been no changes and it's relatively recent. Paragraph 20 states that the buyer is not obligated to purchase the property if it is damaged prior to closing. And I worked for a gentleman one time who it was a day before closing, and there was a bad storm or almost a microburst, and the house did incur some damage on the roof, and the buyer did not close on it. So it's unfortunate, but it's a safety for the buyer. Condition of real estate. This just states that the seller is going to leave the real estate in broom clean condition, so that they're going to move all their items out. And if items are going to be left, whether I'm representing buyer or seller, I want to know that ahead of time, because I want to make sure that the buyer's aware and that there are no issues at the final walkthrough. I'm always citing examples, and I did have an example and where a seller was leaving a couple of large pieces of furniture. It did not get mentioned. The buyer did a final walkthrough, didn't want those pieces of furniture, and so we had to work it out. But it did happen. But that is why we do a final inspection. And yes, just want to make sure that the house is neat and tidy, and the way it was, that's the same representation of how the buyer saw it when they came to look at it initially. Let's see. All right, paragraph 22, the seller representations is that there's no zoning issues or boundary or lot line disputes. You can read through those different, there's A through H there. And then, let's see, talking about improvements to the real estate. So there's a couple different boxes here about, tax exemptions and whatnot. So just be sure to read those carefully to make sure they are correct if you're a seller, and that you are aware if you're a buyer. Typically, the last two, line 301 and 303, don't apply because those special assessments are typically with properties in a subdivision or condominiums. So again, doesn't apply to farm and ranch. Paragraph number 23, this talks about real estate tax escrow, but this is actually if you are buying some land that has yet to be developed, and the previous tax bill, oh goodness, I'm losing my train of thought here, but okay, I'm back. I had to pause it for a minute. I actually had to reread that. So the real estate tax escrow is if you're buying property that is improved, but was most recently taxed as vacant property. So they're trying to catch up on taxes for the improved amounts. So typically, again, doesn't pertain to farm and ranch, but occasionally. Business days and hours, this states that I only work Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. Not true. No, but you can reach me anytime. But those are typical business days, and that is, we need to be aware of that because like lenders have typical business hours and days, and so sometimes that comes into play when we're trying to figure out closing dates. Electronic and digital signatures are acceptable. So, we can either do things in person, or many brokers have digital signature via dotloop or DigiSign. And we can, it's handy in the digital age for sure. Let's see, direction to escrowee. So if this contract, if either party wants to cancel this contract, they do need to notify their attorney, and then the attorney can write a cancellation letter. I cannot do that. Again, didn't go to law school. Notices, paragraph 27. If you are selling a property, if the buyer is contingent on selling their current home in order to purchase the new home, there is a kick-out clause where if another buyer comes in and is not contingent on selling a home, the seller has to give the first buyer the opportunity to remove their contingency. And if they cannot remove their contingency, then the seller can kick out the first buyer and accept the second buyer's offer if they'd like. Let's see. Paragraph 28, performance and time is of the essence. We are all working towards the same goal of meeting your closing date. And I say we in terms of both the buyer and the seller's agent, the buyer and seller themselves, their respective attorneys, and the lender. So anytime that so again, we try to work in like a 30-day time frame, and there are occasions where extensions are needed. And as long as it is a reasonable request and we know the reason behind it, then yes, we should grant that. If it is an unreasonable request, then we need to think twice. I certainly have had a couple of instances where lenders are just backed up and or aren't responding to a time frame as to when they feel the file is going to be approved, and we've given extension after extension, and at some point you just got to cut them off. So that's when we'd have that discussion, of course, at the time as to what's reasonable, what's not, what are the options if you don't accept the extension request. And I say you being the sellers. Let's see. Okay. Dual agency, paragraph 29. So because I am specialized in farm and ranch, the possibility of me being a dual agent, and when I say me, it is my team. So that would be Karen and Amy. And if either of us are listing and selling, then that's considered dual agency. Even though we are different people, we're on the same team and considered one entity. So we just need to notify here if, in fact, we are dual agents. And you should have been talked to, Karen or I should have spoke to you about dual agency way ahead of this. So you should be aware of the pros and cons of that. And if not, make sure you ask. Okay, let's see. Paragraph 30, sale of buyer's real estate. So if a buyer needs to sell their current home in order to purchase this next home, this is where that information comes into play. And, of course, it gives us space for the address. So when I represent sellers, if a buyer has a contingency, I like to look up where the property is, what it's all about, get some information in terms of marketing time, and then need to know if it's currently on the market or if they're planning on putting it on the market, or what the situation is, so that we can so that the seller can make an informed decision as to whether or not they should accept that contingency. I know when purchasing farm and ranch properties, a lot of times the buyer has not put their property on the market because they're waiting to find the right farm and ranch property because they don't come up as often. So if a buyer is selling their home in a subdivision, typically it's a relatively easy sale, but we also want to take a look at what they're going to price it at and do our own due diligence to make sure they're going to price it competitively so that they can sell it in a decent amount of time. And speaking of timing, that comes on to the next page where it talks about, these next two paragraphs for line 396 and 406, basically asking if the real estate is under contract or not. But if it's not, this is where the buyer's agent will state how long they are asking to have in order to get it under contract, and then what date they expect to close by. So, for example, if a property is not listed yet, I would say a typical request would be to allow the buyer to have 30 days to get their current property under contract and then close in another 30 days. There are some instances where the property might already be under contract, and therefore they're just letting us know what date it did go under contract and what day they want to close. Let's see. And paragraph C, line 417, this is where the seller can continue to offer the real estate for sale. If the buyer is contingent on the sale of their current home, the seller can still show the property and offer it for sale, and other buyers can submit offers. Let's see. Cancellation, paragraph 31, page 11, cancellation of prior real estate contract. This paragraph would only apply, for example, if a buyer had offered on another property and then maybe is within their 5-day attorney review period, this comes up, they want to make an offer on it, and they need to make sure that they cancel the first contract before the second one is accepted. Or for another example would be if you're the seller and someone has if you're going to do a kick out, you need to make sure that you can cancel the first buyer before you accept the second buyer's offer. Let's see. Okay, paragraph 32, the home warranty. So home warranties are not something that I typically suggest that sellers automatically offer, but it is a negotiable item during the negotiations. And I always say, if a buyer offers, say, for example, full list price, but wants a home warranty, I'll always suggest to my sellers to go ahead and buy that for them. I mean, after all, it's a nice offer. If say for example though, if the buyer is at their lowest and best offer, or excuse me, at their highest and best offer, and the seller is at their lowest and best offer, and they're barely getting the agreement together, a seller might not be so inclined to pay for a home warranty, but buyers can pay for one and purchase one on their own if they'd like. Well and septic inspections. Now, it's a very typical request, and I recommend that if you're a buyer, that you ask the seller to have a well and septic inspection done. And if I am representing the seller and the buyer asks for that, I always recommend that they go ahead and accept that because, again, it's a very typical request. So same goes for the wood destroying infestation or the pest inspection. That's paragraph 34. Paragraph 35 is possession after closing, and I did touch on this a little bit ahead of time or earlier when we were talking about, moving a whole farm, and it's kind of hard to get all that out in one day. I've actually done both pre-closing possession and post-closing. Post-closing is more common because, of course, then, the seller has the money in the bank. If I have done one pre-closing where a buyer, the seller was able to move out early. The buyer asked to move in early. She granted it. It got a little sticky because the loan didn't come through on time, but it did come through. But that is something that if you want to work that agreement out, the attorneys work that out and they draft a whole different amendment to the contract that both parties agree to, and there's safety nets in there as well for both parties. So it can be done. Just know that. And then let's see, as is condition. So this is a good one. If a seller does not want to make repairs, they will typically ask and list in their listing that the property sells as is. That is basically telling the buyer up front, look, you can do a home inspection because as a buyer, you are always entitled to have a home inspection if you want one. But it's just kind of telling the buyer that, hey, we don't want to do repairs and we don't want you to, ask for credits or whatnot. Give us an offer that you feel is appropriate for the condition that it's in. That said, I will say that I have had an occasion, and I don't like it, but it happens, where, this is a good example. I had a log cabin that the lady had passed away. The son was, closing her estate, and the log cabin, the wood, there were certain pieces that were literally rotting. And the home inspection revealed that they had quotes to fix it. It was literally in the tens of thousands of dollars. So the buyers were still interested, but they did say, look, we know this is supposed to be as is, but this is a really extensive amount of money that we were not prepared for. So they actually renegotiated price on that instance. And my seller was totally he understood it and more than flexible. Okay. Paragraph 37, specified party approval. I honestly don't think I've ever used this paragraph, but an example would be if, say, for example, a married couple came or one individual came and looked at a house, wanted to purchase, but also wanted to make sure that their spouse was in agreement, but the spouse wasn't able to come and see the property. That might be an instance where we need another party's approval. And then attachments typically doesn't get filled out at the time of signing, but I guess attachments might be the addendums for pre and post closing possession, or if there's anything with regards to a tenant farmer having rights to some tillable land that might be associated with the property. Let's see. And for paragraph 39, again, I honestly have never used that paragraph. But it's just if there's additional pages that would be incorporated with this purchase contract, those would be where you check those. And then the last page is your signing page. So that should be completely filled out with all parties' information, both as buyer, seller, their respective agents, their respective attorneys, and of course the lender. So that's it in a nutshell. Actually, one last thing. Along with the purchase contract, the buyer should also be signing the disclosures on the property disclosures. So those, the actual contract package should include the 7.0 contract, the disclosures, and a copy of the buyer's proof of funds or pre-approval letter. Okay, that's it in a nutshell. Thank you so much for listening. I know it was a lot, but call me or text me, or, well, don't text, email me with any questions, and we can certainly set up a time to go over any questions that you have. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.